police brutality, a nation in crisis, and being black in America.
That racist policeman put his neck to suffocate and cut off his breathing to George Floyd. It's no surprise to me, because in a metaphorical sense, that neck suffocation is on every black person in this country by America.
It's time to wake up.
As we speak, thousands of people across the United States and the world are protesting the blatant murder of George Floyd, who was killed in the city of Minneapolis in broad daylight by a white police officer, Mr. Derek Chauvin. The official criminal complaint shows that Officer Chauvin kept his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And for 2 minutes and 53 seconds of that time, George Floyd was unresponsive. The story and the information surrounding this horrific incident is terrible, but unfamiliar, but unfortunately all too familiar for communities of color. People of color are fed up and in search of more than just answers. They're in search of actions. So today we have our first guest is State's Attorney for Prince George's County, SAO Aisha Braveboy. Ms. Braveboy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
The video of George Floyd's death has been seen by millions of people all throughout the world. And you recently released a very strong statement in relation to this, calling the incident a murder, and then also calling for justice. Can you explain to our viewers the difference between the two charges that Officer Chauvin currently faces? There is a charge of third-degree murder, and then there is also a charge of second-degree manslaughter.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show, and thank you so much for your questions. Look, in Maryland, we don't even have third-degree murder. Third-degree murder, it appears, pursuant to Minnesota law, is almost like, it was an accident, but you acted with such a depraved heart that you should have known that something like this could have happened, but it was not necessarily intentional, which I don't believe that, in looking at that video, that it would suggest that the officers had no clue what they were doing. You have a man who is screaming out that he needs to breathe. He's screaming out for his dead mother. You apply that much pressure, not just to his neck, but there were two other officers holding him down in other parts of his body as well. And at some point, they must have felt him go limp. We saw his lights go out in front of the world. It was just horrific to see. There were witnesses there advising the officers of what was happening, and they did absolutely nothing to protect his life. I don't believe that is an accident, which is essentially what a third degree or a manslaughter would account for, something that maybe was not intentional, but you should have known based on the conduct that a death could occur. I think it was something much more than that. And I'm hopeful that Keith Ellison, who is the Attorney General, who is now leading the investigation and will lead the prosecution in this case, will do a thorough review of the autopsy findings as well. And I'm hopeful that an independent autopsy finding will be also conducted by his office. I know the family has conducted one, but I think his office also should conduct one or have one conducted, and take the witness statements of the folks who were there, the person who, had the original video, and those who were in the area who could be witnesses to what happened, and then make an appropriate charging decision at that time.
Okay. And State's Attorney Braveboy, I have a quick question. Of course, I know a lot of people are calling for probably first-degree murder, and just being practical, trying to think about it from all angles. Sometimes I think they might have charged him with third degree, so it's more likely to stick. If they charge him with first degree, at least, some people feel he might get off. easier if they did charge him with third degree as opposed to, first degree as a charge as opposed to third degree.
Well, I don't know what the law says in Minnesota, but typically state's attorneys and county attorneys in this in this instance, he's called it the county attorney, and I believe it's like this all across the country. We can charge with multiple offenses. We often charge the first or the second because we have to be fair about how we charge it, because the first we would have to prove premeditation, but second degree murder is we can charge that along with manslaughter and assault. So what we typically do is charge more than one theory of the murder and then present evidence in court and let the jury determine what the appropriate conviction would be. So,
Okay.
So he has the ability, like all of us do, to charge more than one count.
And that's good, because that kind of brings me to my next question. We see a lot of recorded video and incidents of police brutality, and the officers are charged or maybe acquitted within the trial process. And a lot of people are a little bit confused at that because they see video of what they feel like is a criminal act. And so can you kind of explain why the trial may not go into where an officer is actually, the
Sure.
trial goes for them to be, yeah.
Sure. So officers, as being in their position, one of trust, essentially, and to protect our communities, they are given certain rights, and one of those rights is to use reasonable force under the circumstances, and sometimes that may include deadly force, depending on if that officer reasonably believes that he or she or someone else is in imminent fear of death or serious bodily harm. Then the officer can use force and can use deadly force. So what happens is when we look at the officer's actions, what we have to determine is what a reasonable officer would do under those circumstances. That is the standard to determine whether or not an officer exceeded their authorized use of force. And so usually what happens is we look at how the officer was trained, what are the different levels of force that can be applied. Do they have the equipment to apply different levels of force? So do they have, like the batons? That's one device that they could potentially use, which is not considered a lethal device. They can use pepper spray or some other kind of device that they may have to stop the threat, whatever that threat is. It doesn't go from 0 to 100. Like there is, unless let's say the suspect is pointing a gun at the officer. Obviously, at that point, the officer would be authorized to use deadly force because there is a reasonable fear that that officer would be killed himself or suffer some, serious bodily injury if the suspect did shoot him or her. But usually those aren't the circumstances that we're seeing. What we're typically seeing are individuals who are, engaging, or the officers engaging in some type of restraint because they're trying to take them into custody and put them into their cruiser, or the person potentially could be, moving around in a cruiser or something like that. Those are the typically what we see. And then the types of force that we have seen are officers hitting, kicking, slamming, suspects, and it shocks the conscience. It's terrible. And what the state's attorney's job is to do is to investigate that. After, well, typically what happens is the police department's internal affairs unit does their investigation. They present findings to us, and then we conduct a separate an independent investigation, and we look at their findings, but then we also do our own investigation. We will get witness interviews if we can. Oftentimes the officer does not interview with us. They're not required to. It's like every other defendant. They have a right to remain silent. So we do our best to do a thorough investigation, and then we make the appropriate charging decisions. I want to say that, like, my first charging decision to charge an officer was made, I think, within my first 2 months in office, and it was an officer who had beat a homeless man who was in his custody. He was handcuffed and seat belted, and the officer used blunt force, and it hit him in his head and about his body. And we prosecuted that case because the officer, we believe, used excessive force. It was unreasonable for him to think that the guy who was handcuffed with his hand behind his back was of any threat to that officer. And so as a result, we did prosecute the officer. We did get a conviction of that officer, and that officer was sentenced for second-degree assault. So those are the kind of issues that we have to look at. But a jury or a judge could find that the state didn't meet their burden, that we didn't prove that the level of force that was used was not appropriate. And in which case, a judge or a jury could determine that the officer was justified in the level of force that was used, and they sometimes could find against the state in those cases. So it's a very nuanced, but the reality is officers are placed in a position of trust. Their jobs are not easy. Oftentimes they do deal with suspects that aren't necessarily cooperative, but it is the job of that officer to be professional. It's the job of that officer to obey all of their standard operating procedures. And when they violate those, and when they use excessive force, it is my job to hold them responsible.
And of course, I appreciate your advocacy here for Prince George's County. And I guess just me as a, Black man, of course, there is a fear that I carry every day. Every day I step outside. And I know recently we've had, while we're talking about Prince George's County, we've had instances with law enforcement officers. Leonard Shan, he was murdered at near Prince George's County Mall in Hyattsville. Then we have DeMonte Ward Blake, who was paralyzed. And, I guess my question would be, why haven't those officers, been charged? I know a lot of the community has expressed interest in figuring out what's going on with the investigation, and it was very, just to watch those videos, just as I watched George Floyd, that's what I think all the time.
Absolutely. Well, I can tell you that both of those incidents are under investigation by my office, and I am not at liberty to really talk about them. What I can tell you is that when we conclude the investigations, we will provide a very transparent report to the public, and whatever our charging decisions are, the public will know, and we will provide them with as much detail as we can. Now, if we decide to move forward with a case, I can't provide all of the details because I'm not allowed to try the case in the public. But we typically, what we do is we let the public know what the charges are, and what our intent is moving forward in terms of a trial. So that's kind of what I would let the public know. If we decide, let's say in any case like this, where there is that public interest, that we don't have sufficient evidence to move forward, then we will let the public know that as well, and we would also give that explanation. But again, the standard that we have to use is reasonable officer. What would a reasonable officer do under the circumstances? But there's a lot of complexities to these cases. We also have to have final autopsy findings and a report before we charge these types of cases, because it is very technical how someone dies, just like what you saw, which was a to me like a big problem in the George Floyd case. You know, in the charging documents themselves, which at that stage, all you need is probable cause. And clearly there was probable cause that a crime was committed. So, but to put into the charging documents a partial finding of a medical examiner, I think was very, very flawed, because what it said essentially was, here's what it's not. Well, here's what we don't see. We don't see evidence of a particular type of asphyxiation, because asphyxiation presents in so many different ways. And to have that as part of the charging document, I think was really reckless, and it was unnecessary, because at that stage, it wasn't what my burden is, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. It is simply, probable cause. And so I have to make sure that I remain disciplined and not going too fast, because I don't want to ever compromise a case. And so once we get all of the relevant reports, and once we're able to interview all of the relevant witnesses, we will then make decisions, and we will definitely present that to the public. I don't shy away. Let me just let you know.
SAO Brave Boy.
Oh,
yes, SAO Brave Boy. You don't, and we really appreciate that. A final question. How has your experiences growing up in a predominantly African-American community of Prince George's County, and still living here and being the top cop, how has that framed your point of reference for criminal justice and policing within Prince George's County?
Look, I grew up in Prince George's County in Upper Marlboro at a time when Black men were told, don't go to Upper Marlboro after the street lights come on, okay? So I have been in this county long enough to know the racist history that has been in this county and in our police department. I was, when I first started in county government, the K-9 unit of the police department was under federal investigation, and they had to settle a civil rights lawsuit because Black men in particular, the K-9 unit was being used against them in a way that was completely violated their civil rights, and it was horrific. So I understand the history of this county. I am not immune to the effects of the history of this county. And so being the state's attorney, I am very committed to making sure that I recognize where there are issues in our system, and I try to do my best to fix them. Now, I can't do it alone, and I can't do it in 1 year, but I believe that leading by example, holding officers accountable, making sure that I am transparent with the public, I believe that that is the way that I can help to improve this system. But quite frankly, it takes people like you, Mr. Mitchell, letting us know that you still can't walk outside without feeling some kind of way. I was at an event this morning, and I started off by saying, I can't breathe. I can't breathe because you can't breathe, Martin. You can't breathe. I walk outside the house. I don't feel the fear that you fear, but you're my brother. Right? So I can't breathe if you can't breathe. And I think that's what I have to bring to the work that I do every day.
SAO Brave Boy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for everything that you do within the community, and we really appreciate you. Please stay tuned. Our next guest is Jonathan Newton from the National Association Against Police Brutality.
Bless up, world.
Have you heard about social distancing?
You gotta stay at home if you can.
This is very serious. We have to stay home.
Not just to protect yourself, but to protect others.
You don't want to spread the coronavirus in your community.
Don't go outside, even if you think you're fine.
Stay at least 6 feet away from other people. 2, arm's length.
2 arms.
Do not hug.
Don't shake hands.
Yeah, no touching for now.
Any avoidable trips, avoid.
Nope, not traveling anywhere.
Pick up food or get it delivered.
Staying home helps lower the risk for everyone.
Protect your life, protect your loved ones, and protect the world.
We can save lives, okay?
Stay at home.
Stay at home.
Stay at home.
That's the key.
Just because you're at home
doesn't mean that we can't be alone together.
Together.
Cool?
Worried your friend's struggling but don't know how to reach out? You could say how are you or get a fake tattoo. You could ask with an app if it works for you. You could write him a text or knit him a sweater. If you can't be together, you could write him a letter. Whatever gets you talking. Whatever gets you talking. You could chat on the game, kick off your flip-flops. You could ask on your couch while you binge watch. However you do it, you gotta ask a friend. And if they don't share, you can ask again. Whatever gets you talking. Whatever gets you talking.
There are a lot of ways to reach out to a friend about their mental health. Learn how you can help at seizetheawkward.org.
Welcome back. Joining us now is attorney at law and president of the National Association Against Police Brutality, Jonathan Newton. Thank you for joining us. Now, Jonathan, you used to be a police officer. So can you kind of tell us about your experience as a Black man and a police officer in America?
Well, it's like living in two environments at the same time. One, you are sworn to uphold the law, and two, you are generally being asked to uphold the law in areas of communities of color, and some of the policies are adverse to our community. And so it's a definite inherent conflict that you're dealing with on a continual basis. And so what you do is you measure, how you are enforcing the law with actually the way that you're trying to enforce the law according to the spirit of the law, hopefully, in a fair and balanced way. And so it's a very tough predicament to be in. But at the same time, I still believe that we actually need good officers of color to be involved with law enforcement more in our community, and they need to step up to the plate in terms of talking about how we're to craft policy that allows for use of force, and talk about the various differences that officers coming from different perspectives and background, how they interpret the policies and the use of force guidelines that are there. For instance, somebody moving from Iowa wouldn't necessarily understand how to relate to somebody in an inner city environment like Baltimore or even DC. And so as an African American and as a Black law enforcement officer, we have that connection to our community oftentimes, not all the time, often, more often than other people moving from outside of our communities.
Oh, and Mr. Newton, I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to start, I guess you could be really blunt with me here. Do you believe that police officers in America have a problem with the use of excessive force and sometimes deadly force to Black Americans?
There's no absolute question. I mean, there's undoubtedly, we police in African American communities differently than we police in other communities. That's not only said here in Prince George's County, but that's all across this country. There are things, the way that we interact with communities of color, that we just do not do that in white communities. And I'm not the first officer that has said that. When the approach is made to white or affluent members of the community, of citizens, it's sir and ma'am. And when it's in our communities, it's hey, my man, boy, come here, and all kinds of different things. And when you take those different approaches, you are starting off the process in an entirely discriminatory manner. And that feeds this continual pattern that we see of, it's institutionalized racism. At core, when you treat one group of people based on the color of their skin different than you treat another group of people, that is the quintessential example of racism. And we have had that going on in policing for quite some time. This is nothing new.
What can Black men and Black women do to protect themselves in the moment and then after in cases of police brutality and excessive force?
One thing I say is that and this is very difficult to ask people to do, but you have to understand you are not on equal footing when you're facing an officer of the law on the side of the street somewhere. He has on a utility belt. He's trained with all kinds of use of force and body manipulation techniques to be able to win that fight. Also, he's going to be able to summon up and bring somebody there within 3 to 6 minutes that's going to be able to force multiply the situation where you're going to be one person facing 4 or 5 people. So what I'm telling people is to survive the moment, comply. If you can, record the moment, okay? And then also report that to a non-government organization like ours so that we can begin to build a record to be able to seek remedies for them, whether they be criminal remedies or whether they're administrative sanctions against that officer. Right now, what is happening is that people are taking the opportunity to have these confrontations on the side of the street, and that's not the place. He can be judge, jury, and executioner all in one go until we change the law. And so I am asking people to simply allow them to, you're going to run across officer friendly, or you're going to run across officer jackass. And if you run across officer jackass, let him be a jackass and record every bit of it. And then simply take that to the appropriate agency and see if we can help have him removed from the force without putting yourself in physical jeopardy.
And I do appreciate that because, as a Black man, I do have this fear every day just walking outside. But you speaking to it from a police officer perspective, you as a police officer, we might recognize here in the urban community, blue code of silence. So we have George Floyd, and then we have Officer Chauvin, who was on his neck. Then we have, Officer Tao, who watched it happen. So of course, he was complicit. He might as well have done it himself. At least that's how we see it, because he didn't jump in to stop him, nor did, any of the other officers. So of course we talked about what, we could do as Black males and Black people to protect ourselves, but what, can, I guess the police department do, or what can we expect them to do to, correct this blue code of silence? Because right is right.
So police officers, so I was disinvited from the police party after I blew the whistle on a sheriff. And subsequently, that sheriff then retaliated by making false allegations against me, and was the beginning of my journey into the criminal justice system. Officers have no real mechanism. They can report misconduct, and usually what happens is they're drummed out. The police force is almost like a gang, and until we really face that reality and offer some kind of mechanism that officers can report this stuff and not expect any kind of pushback, and until they get on the page that it's best in their interest to really get rid of these types of officers, we can expect this issue to continue. But with regards to what specifically can they do? What can an officer do for instance, the officers that were watching? Okay, if you or I were to stand in front of a store that we knew was conducting a nefarious activity, drug activity, and we watched it, and we kind of, even tacitly participated in it, you probably would be charged, at least at the very minimum, with conspiracy, okay? If you had some kind of agreement in place. These officers who are watching this had an agreement in place, and they do that because they're working together as a workforce. There's an agreement in place. And whether that can be proven in court or not, that's for the prosecutor's office to take up. But these officers who were watching that action and saw that, they never interpreted that conduct as criminal conduct. And that is the fundamental disconnect that we need to focus in on. When that officer put his knee upon George Floyd's neck, he never in his wildest imaginations thought that that could be deemed a crime, I'm pretty sure. And that's where the rubber meets the road, is that when we have use of force rules and guidelines and laws that are ambiguous and amorphous, these officers can do this type of behavior without having any idea, not only any idea, but even if they thought that they were breaking the law, they don't even have any fear that the law will be upheld against them, because most prosecutors, and this is why we're calling for independent state level investigations and state prosecutors, the prosecutor's office has to work with the local law enforcement. And so most of them will not take up charges. I do have to, give credit where credit is due. Aisha Bravemore and Marilyn Mosby, they have been prosecuting officers. And so they do what others have not chosen to do for whatever reasons. But
so in your professional opinion, do you believe that all of the officers should be charged in relation to the George Floyd murder? And what do you think the charges should be?
All right. So,
if so,
in my professional opinion, it's very difficult to come up with a criminal statute that they have violated to make a charge. Okay, and that's a tough pill for me to swallow as a human being. But what we have to do when we talk about criminalizing conduct is we have to look to a statute to find what conduct is it. Could this be reckless endangerment? I don't know based on Minnesota or Minnesota law what that is. Okay, and was there any talk? Well, let's look at the federal law. Is there a conspiracy to deny him his civil rights? You know, that could be the case if you look at Section 18, USC 18242. If they had some conversation about, you know, and it was based on race or one of the classifications, that could be a criminal charge that could take place. But from everything that I've seen so far, the observers, and this is something that, you know, comes up in the first year of law school. When you see somebody committing a crime and you don't do anything, you can't be held culpable for that person committing the crime. You have no obligation to stop them from committing a crime. However, I do believe that we should have a higher standard for police officers. They have taken an oath to protect the Constitution. And so the question is, and the area of ambiguity is does that oath include a positive affirmation that they are going to protect life? And Supreme Court has ruled that that officers actually don't have to protect, they don't have to do anything, you know. And so the Constitution sets a very minimal standard for officers protecting life.
And Mr. Newton, of course, a lot of us in our workplace, if we were to have infractions, you know, a handful of infractions, we would be let go, you know, reprimanded. So, you know, my question is, how many officer complaints is too many? Because we know that, you know, Tao had a handful, Chauvin had more than a dozen, so.
Yeah. So, you know, when you look at what's the disciplinary history of these officers, you're seeing a pattern, right? And you're also seeing a pattern that allows that the police department itself has allowed them to continue to operate. And so there's an established pattern in practice of allowing these officers to do this, and the officers themselves doing it. And so, you know, when you look at discipline, there needs to be a standard officer disciplinary policy, like a matrix, okay? That does not happen. That can happen at the agency level. If you have this many infractions, we're going to put you on suspension. And I believe in progressive discipline inside police agencies. If this happens, we're going to bring you in and we're going to have a talk with you. If this happens, we're going to bring you in and have another talk with you. If this happens, we're going to suspend you for 3 days. If this happens, we're going to suspend you for 5 days. And if this happens, then we're going to, you know, terminate you 90 days and just move it all the way up to termination. But what you have in Maryland and so many states is you have police unions, the Fraternal Order of Police and others, that have created laws that protect and insulate police officers from almost any discipline, okay? And so, you know, to quote the words of one of the police chiefs that I talked to, he says, it's almost like I can't do anything to my officers. And we have to really begin to look at our state legislators to say, hey, listen, you know, we are paying a heavy penalty for allowing these officers to do what they're doing, to have this discretion. Why are you siding so with police unions when it comes to protecting these officers and allowing them to continue the patterns that we see in existence? And so that's a question that we have to begin to leverage our political voice against those state legislators who continue to allow this stuff to happen.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan Newton. We really appreciate everything that you do for the community as well as your organization. Yes, please stay tuned for our final guest, Mr. Michael Tosin Banner, a correspondent for Black News and the electronic urbanreport.com.
Debt. If you get in too deep, members of the NFCC, the National Foundation for Credit Counseling, can help you put debt in its place.
Credit cards took charge of my financial life. A certified credit counselor helped me get back in control.
Connect with an NFCC certified credit counselor at your local member agency today. We'll help you put debt in its place. Go to nfcc.org/stopdebt or call 877-410-6322.
You could be spreading the coronavirus without realizing you have it, so do your part and stay home. It's important to limit in-person interaction with anyone outside of your immediate household, but phone and video chat are safe ways to connect. It's also important to limit social gatherings. If you need essential items like food and medicine, try using a delivery service. If you must leave your house for essential items, or if you want to take a walk for exercise, make sure to wear a cloth face covering. Stay at least 6 feet away from other people. Try not to touch frequently touched surfaces like light signals, street signs, or benches. And wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds as often as possible. This advice applies to people of any age, including teens and younger adults. It takes all of us to slow the spread of the coronavirus, so stay home unless absolutely necessary. Visit Coronavirus.gov for the latest information.
Here are your AARP top tips on caregiver preparedness during coronavirus. First, form a caregiving team. Create a list of people in your family and friend network who can help with caregiving tasks. Take an inventory of supplies in your loved one's home. Try to have a 2-week supply of essential items. Make a list of the care recipient's medications and medical contacts. Be sure to have prescriptions on hand and ask the pharmacist for an extra 30-day supply. Make a plan to stay connected. To prevent social isolation, set up available technology to help loved ones stay connected and schedule regular chats. Finally, maintain your own self-care. Follow the Centers for Disease Control's guidelines for coronavirus safety. And have a backup plan for care in case you become ill. For more caregiving tips during the coronavirus pandemic, go to aarp.org/caregiving.
Our final guest for this very important edition of Wake Up, focusing on police brutality in America, is Tolson Banner, a correspondent for Black News and electronic.urbanreport.com. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Tolson Banner.
Thank you for having me.
As a Black man in America, what is your opinion on the acts of police brutality occurring across the county and across the country?
You know, as a Black man, you grow up understanding and seeing police brutality. I can recall the first time I was stopped by the police. I was 12 years old, and they stopped me because I was on my bicycle, and they were telling me that some white woman bicycle had been stolen, and I possibly fit the description. So you get acclimated to it at a very early age. You learn to try to maneuver and work around it, but inevitably you are faced with it every day.
And I believe that, you know, the media plays a big part in, you know, the public perception and the systematic racism that we see. Do you believe that it plays a substantial part in the racism we see today?
Well, you know, the whole idea of racism is so systemic throughout the entire fabric of society that it can't hide its ugly head. And what the media does is that they perpetuate the same stereotypes that we see, especially when it comes to the Black man, the big Black boogeyman, as you saw with the incident in Central Park. The transition that the white woman went into, the damsel in distress, she did it in such a smooth segue that you would think that it was actually happening. But her dramatization of her being attacked by the big Black evil, she used that stereotype to weaponize this Black guy.
Of course. And you know, Mr. Banner, just to follow up, if we're talking about the media and how they will portray one opposed to the other, you could think of, you know, Brock Turner, the Stanford swimmer. Don't you remember they were talking about like how good his swim records were?
Yes.
He was referred to as a boy many different times, as of where,
yes,
16-year-old and 15-year-old, he's a man. But of course, you have, the Central Park Five, where they were portrayed as, thugs, and the same thing you have Trump saying. You have Trump
That's right.
saying the same thing he was saying.
Wilding out. That's what they refer to him as, wilding out. That's why I've had problems with that program that's on TV, and they call it wilding out. We don't understand that these words are used to weaponize against us. I can't think of the young man's name who is on that show, Nick Cannon. But I told my son, you should never watch that show. You should never watch that show.
Oh, the wilding out,
Wilding out, because those are the same words. Those are the same words that was used for the Central Park.
How would one combat that stereotype, that media perception, as a Black person, as a African American woman, African American female, when you're in the moment or when you're in situations like that? Like, what has been your experience?
I'll give you a great example. In my office, when I'm at work and people say, wow, man, he was blackballed. And these are white people talking to me. And I correct them. I say, no, he was whiteballed. And they say, well, why did you say that? I said, because the systemic racism is inherent in the language. You should never say blackballed. It's whiteballed. Because you are the one that's accusing me of being evil or bad or doing something that's not seen in the good graces of God. You see, so we have to be careful with the language. And one of the great things that came out of the Black Power movement was for us to take control of the language that we use. You see, we have to be very aware of the language that we use. And so often I hear Black people saying blackball, not even thinking about it. The only time Black is used in a positive manner in this society is Black Friday. That's the only time.
I don't disagree with you there. So is one born racist?
Well, I believe that racism is a survival mechanism where one perceives a lack of resources, and the fear and greed takes over. And so out of fear and greed, you move into a survival mode that you don't want to share.
Well, in relation to racism, how does systematic racism within the United States, as you brought up earlier, play into the death of George Floyd and what we're seeing right now?
Well, you go right to the Atlantic enslavement trade. And so that's why it's an oxymoron for Black people to say they're Black capitalists, because it was our enslaved brutality that formed the basis to capitalism. So how can you be a Black capitalist when it was your enslavement that formed the basis to the system? And so you begin with a system that doesn't see you as a human being. And now, just because you walked off of the plantations, you walk into segregation, you walk into Jim Crow, you walk into vigilantes, you walk into the KKK, you walk into housing discrimination, you walk into redlining, you walk into gentrification. So your humanity is never, ever, ever recognized. So seeing that racist policeman put his neck to suffocate and cut off his breathing to George Floyd, it's no surprise to me, because in a metaphorical sense, that neck suffocation is on every Black person in this country by America. And when we seek to break the leg of the neck, of the knee rather, that's on our neck, they blame us for breaking the leg. And they never want to talk about the knee that's on our neck.
So what do you think needs to happen to stop those, physical and metaphorical knees on the necks of Black people?
This will never end with just charging the other 3 officers. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the same one they had in South Africa, where we have to drill down. We have to drill down into the very fabric of racist society, you see? And just because a white person puts on a Black Lives Matter t-shirt or marches with me in the street, they can walk right back into their white privilege and their white entitlement in a nanosecond, okay? So I'm calling for white people. You know what I want them to do? I want white people to put on a march, call for a march of just white folks, and go march on the mayor's office, go march on the state capitol, and go march on the federal government, and tell them to stop using your tax dollars for the killing of unarmed Black people. That will stop overnight, you see? There are certain things that we are not going to be able to do. We're going to have allies with white folks. And those white folks who claim to be our allies, who claim to be of goodwill and good conscience, I'm asking them to do that.
And of course, what would be your position on Black gun ownership? Do we all need to own guns if we can?
That's an American right.
Okay.
Do you think that gun ownership in Black America in relation to what is going on with systematic racism and the police brutality incident?
I didn't catch some of the
question one more time.
Yeah.
Sure. So what I'm saying is, do you feel as though Black gun ownership will protect African-American citizens or Black citizens in relation to incidents of police brutality and misconduct from police? What is the connection between Black gun ownership and these incidents of police brutality and police misconduct?
Black ownership, as it correlates to dealing with the police, would be an all-out assault on Black people. We saw that with Philando Castile. Yeah. He was a member of the NRA. He was a member of the NRA, and he announced that he had a gun in the car. And what did that lead to? It led to an all-out execution of Philando Castile. You see, so it's not so much about Black gun ownership. Of course, we have the right to own a gun. We have a right to protect ourselves. But we always look just at the police, and the police are doing what? They are enforcing laws and policies that have been put in place by people we have elected, the politicians. You see, and so what needs to happen with our votes is we need to start voting for those people that we hold accountable, and challenge them on policies and laws that are used by the police for their vicious brutality. See, and we need to really take a look at how the grand juries are convened. You see, because the way grand juries are convened, they're really used to get police off the hook for their killing of unarmed Black people. So it's not just the police here. I don't want people to think it's just the police. It's the politicians who hide behind those $500, $1,000 suits and smile in our faces and kiss the babies. You see, there's not enough discussion about the policies and the laws that they put in place and the judges who are appointed by people we have elected. See, now this is where our vote becomes more powerful than the gun.
Okay, so then the question I have then is with that would be this. In relation to Maryland and Prince George's County specifically, how do you feel as though the elected officials are doing in relation to policies and procedures that would affect sort of acts or perceived acts of police brutality and police misconduct within the county or the state?
I don't see no difference in the state or the county than what's going on across the country. The police are such a powerful union across America that they have wielded their power in every state, in every county, in every locale you can name. So they have a consistent stranglehold on most cities, municipalities, state government, and county governments. You see? So it has to be a nationwide effort, a national effort, in order to curtail and dismantle this type of brutality against unarmed people. And that's the only way. It has to be a national effort. And we have to drill down. It's not just these policies and procedures that are put in place regarding property, because most of these laws are tied to property, you see? And because they're tied to property, you must remember that what? Black people, when we got here, and for the most part to this day, are seen as property. So our humaneness is still being denied. See, that's what it comes down to. That's why we have to have this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because our humaneness needs to be recognized. And that's one of the major problems I see.
I completely agree. And we know that police brutality and racism, they've been around for a long time. Now we're just seeing them on live. Do you think that people are desensitized? When new things happen, new incidents happen?
Well, I think what happens is that, and I think this is what happened in this particular case, is that Black people have gotten to a point where we were paralyzed by analyzing the situations. And so we end up getting backed into a corner. And when you get backed into a corner, the flight or fight takes over. And what is the flight or fight? The flight or fight is the intelligence inherent in the organism. It has nothing to do with your rationalization. It has nothing to do with you trying to figure out what I'm going to do next. If you ever had a mouse in your house and you backed it into a corner, as small as that mouse is, it will turn around and come right back at you. Against all odds, it will come back at you, because the flight or fight takes over the nature of the organism. And that's what you're seeing. The flight or fight has taken over the nature of the Black man and the Black woman in this country regarding their response to these harsh conditions that people expect us to continue to exist in.
Mr. Tosin Banner, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for giving your perspective in relation to this very special edition of The Wake Up. We also like to thank the rest of our guests for joining us as well, and in relation to the topic of police brutality within America. We want to make sure that we at The Wake Up are making sure that everyone is staying informed, staying engaged, and staying safe in Prince George's County.